Okay, welcome everyone. We'll start. So, despite a challenging 12 months, continued geopolitical unrest, increases in the cost of living, inflationary pressures, through to the rise of new tech such as AI, our research is telling us that 58% of employers and 56% of employees are optimistic for the broader economic climate and future employment opportunities. Employers have told us they are committed to improving work environments, ensuring that both current employees and new hires feel at ease at work. They're also telling us they're keen to provide opportunities for new experiences, including training, with the goal of enabling the workforce to thrive over the 12 months ahead and beyond. From a candidate perspective, they're telling us that they remain thoughtful and considered when it comes to making career decisions, including changing jobs. If we look to the future, employers have highlighted two key challenges for 2024. One, talent retention, so in other words, keeping your best people, and two, recruiting the right talent as opposed to the first candidate that becomes available. Employees are looking for competitive salaries and benefits. However, they are also seeking organizations that are looking to support their personal career growth and career development. And then hybrid flexible working isn't going anywhere. My name is Maureen Lind, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us. So if we move, I suppose, what is in this year's guide, the guide itself will go into a lot more detail on the topics that we're showing you here, but I'd like to take you now through a snapshot of some of the key findings. So our research shows that hiring intentions remain strong. 85% of employers planning to hire over the next 12 months, and down slightly from by 5% last year, but that was an all-time high. Recruiting the right talent is now the biggest external challenge employers expect to face in the coming year, and that is overtaking the cost of living for last year. However, that continues to be a challenge that employers expect to face over 2024. The biggest internal challenge remains talent retention. And interesting, one of the other key challenges that employers have cited is company culture. And that has increased from 25% last year to 32% this year. So almost 1 in 3 organizations are concerned about their company culture, and that it could be a potential challenge over FY24. And then skill shortages continues to be an issue. Almost all employers we surveyed said they had experienced some level of skill shortages in the last 12 months, and that's been a continued theme now for a number of years. In terms of salaries, they have changed. 79% of employers increased salaries over the last year. That did come down slightly from the previous year. But the reason being 57% of employers said that it was a direct result of the cost of living. Interestingly, 76% of employers have also told us they are planning to increase salaries over 2024. One of the key internal challenges for employers I highlighted earlier in the previous slide is talent retention. So it is worth noting that employees surveyed told us that they are being driven to change jobs due to the lack of career progression and also the lack of career development at 38%. So these were the two main reasons employees moved jobs in the last year. So to discuss these findings and more the world of work, talent, the challenges that are ahead from an economics perspective or positive, I'm delighted to welcome Gerard Brady, who's the head of national policy and chief economist with IBEC, and Vicky O'Neill, HR strategy specialist, also from IBEC. So welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss our salary guide. So, Gerard, I might go to you first. The Irish economy continued to perform very well, and it's during a period of rising interest rates, global inflation. However, there does seem to be a sense that we're entering a period of more moderate growth, I think, over 24, 25. Is that, I suppose it'd be interesting to get your view, and then I suppose how will that potentially impact the labour market?
Yeah, so more or less is we've seen incredibly strong growth. Like it is really worth putting in context. Since 2019, we've added about 350,000 people to the Irish labour market in terms of new jobs. And just putting that in historical context, that's more jobs than were added during the whole boom era between 2002 and 2007. So it's more jobs that were at its fastest period of job growth in the history of the Irish labour market. If you look internationally, the Irish labour market has grown by a little over 10% during that period. Most labour markets versus 2019 are kind of still at 0% or maybe 1% up on where they were. So we've seen this enormous growth in Ireland that just hasn't happened elsewhere. So while others were talking about the great resignation, we were almost seeing a great hiring at the same time. So it was a completely different environment. Ultimately, that has continued through this year. We've added about 100,000 jobs. Our view is that it will start to slow as we reach 2024, and already we are seeing signs of it starting to slow, but slow from such a high base in terms of the growth rates we have seen. So if you look at some of the figures we look at out there, the administrative data that Revenue have on payrolls starting to top out in recent months, some of the kind of hiring metrics that are out there from various private sector organizations starting to look like vacancies are falling a little bit or flattening out. And we're starting to see feedback from our own members that, you know, people are a bit more cautious going into 2024. What's that driven by? Effectively, look, the global economy has gone through an awful lot in recent years, but we're now seeing a period where interest rates are rising for the first time in over a decade. And the whole point of interest rates rising is that they're to slow the economy so that you can slow inflation. So this isn't unexpected. It's not a surprise. The whole point of rising interest rates is that the labour market will slow, inflation will cool down, and that things will return to a more normal equilibrium into 2024. So that's what we see happening. We're not overly concerned about a kind of an accelerated or deceleration, a very fast deceleration in activity, but we are coming into a period where things are going to be a good bit softer than they have been. And we probably see that continuing through 2024 into 2025 as well, because interest rates take time to kind of wash through the system, and you know, their impact on both households and businesses takes time to have an impact more broadly in the economy. But still an economy where growth is happening. Ireland probably better positioned than most labour markets. And if you look across other European labour markets, they're seeing falling working age populations in Germany and Italy and most of Eastern Europe. Ireland still has, from a labour market potential point of view, a really good story to tell, because we still have that growth in population. We're going to add about 1 million people over the next decade. So there's still a long-term positive story, but we are going to see a deceleration, I suppose, in the next 12, 18 months.
Yeah. So the expectation from your perspective would be that we're still, because we're at full employment now, more people working in the economy than we've ever had before. But while there's a deceleration, that will continue to be the case?
Yeah, I think so. And look, there's a number of reasons for that, not just the interest rates, but also Irish economic activity generally, and even in the domestic facing sectors, is a derivative of what's happening in the global economy. We're so tied to what's happening in Europe, what's happening in China and the US and elsewhere. And ultimately the US is doing okay. The European economy is struggling a little bit, and borderline recession in a lot of the big markets in Europe, and the same in China, which has driven so much of global economic growth in the last decade, slowing down. So Irish growth is a mirror of that kind of global slowdown in activity. The one advantage we do have over other countries is that tie again to the US, where things are still very strong. And we talk to companies all the time who have said they've invested in Ireland ahead of other countries, and that because they're still doing more in the US, they're going to be doing more globally as well in the US multinational space, which has, you know, had a troubled year this year, but is starting to see continued strong growth. It's probably more in that consumer facing sector that we see some major challenges, both on the consumer demand side because of interest rates, but also because of cost. Like the major thing that we hear from companies now is the concern about cost of labor and regulated labor costs rather than what's happening in the market. It's what's happening in government policy, auto enrollment, living wage, and all the rest.
Yeah, and we might talk about that a little bit later around some labour costs that are coming our way. But just mentioning of increase in costs, and again, as I said, absolutely, employers are foreseeing one of their big external is that skill shortage challenge in 2024. But 79% of employers increased salaries over the previous year. But interestingly, 76% are telling us they're planning to increase salaries over 2024. So is that surprising to you? Is that sustainable?
It's not surprising, and look, in some sectors the changes that are coming with regulated wages mean that you have no choice but to increase wages. In other sectors, the mix of a very tight labour market still. So even though I'm saying we're decelerating, we're still at under 5% unemployment. Which is in an Irish context really unique. It's been very few years in the last 40 or 50 years that we've had that low an unemployment level, and you're still seeing growing demand, even though it's not as quick as the demand growth was. So that does create a really tight labour market, and those kind of wage numbers in terms of the share of companies giving pay increases very similar in the Hayes surveys as they are in IBEX surveys. It's the majority of employers in that space, and again reflected in the fact that the majority of employers are finding those skills gaps hard to fill, and not just skills gaps, but finding people at any skill level is difficult, and remains difficult, and will remain difficult. So even though it's decelerating that we're talking about, unfortunately for HR teams, it's still going to be hard to find people for some time ahead.
Yeah, as you said, we're coming from a very high level originally. Yeah, Vicky, I might just bring in, I suppose, the HR element and the challenges you said for the HR community. Skill shortages, as I said, the big challenge. 85% of employers surveyed also told us they plan to hire over the next 12 months. Are you seeing employers doing anything different when it comes to sourcing or finding that talent, which essentially is working, but how to attract it and into their organizations?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think organizations are taking a much more strategic approach to talent attraction and retention, and a fundamental part of that is the skills conversation. So we're definitely seeing organizations, I guess, deconstruct their static job profiles to focus on skills, and that is reflected in an uptick, for example, on the apprenticeship program, as well as DEI activities. So while we're at I guess, the pinnacle moment in Irish history in terms of full employment, there's still quite a high proportion of people in the Irish market that would consider themselves underemployed. In fact, there's about 500,000. 20% of those are actually really willing and open to take on more career opportunities. But a barrier to them doing that is often caring responsibilities or disabilities, or the fact that maybe they're in a different cohort that organizations haven't traditionally lent into to be able to source talent from. So I think organizations are becoming a lot more open-minded, and that is reflected even in your own Hayes results. I saw 71% of employers actually stating willingness to learn as more important than current skill sets. And when we look at our own existing HR priority survey, the top 3 priorities for organizations: number 1 is learning and development, number 2, leadership development, and number 3, performance. So I definitely see a more systematic approach to talent attraction in terms of breaking down those static job profiles and looking at sort of personas and skills and opportunities to learn, and then trying to bring into their organization that culture of continuous learning. Yeah. The other side of that coin, Maureen, I think, is organizations reflecting on what their total employee value proposition is, because the war on wages it's not sustainable. So organizations really looking to reshape or re-promote their purpose and trying to bring in talent into their organization that is focused on other things besides that sort of base remuneration, because, as I said, it's not a sustainable competitive advantage.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So organizations are beginning to think differently. And you mentioned the apprenticeship. That was a marked increase from last year, where now 1 in 4 companies are considering apprenticeships, according to our research. So companies are beginning to think differently, but that was one that definitely stood out. Just the other area then, Jared, visas. Are you seeing anything else coming through from government around supporting organizations around the skill shortage? Visas being one. I know there's a lot more happening in that area.
Yeah, and on visas and work permits, look, we had lots of issues during COVID in terms of backlogs in that system, starting to get better and improve. So like, if you look at the numbers in a normal year pre-COVID, we were probably issuing around 15,000 visas or work permits a year. We're now issuing probably 40,000 last year and another 40,000 this year. So companies are obviously, along with, as Vicky said, looking for more talent in places they haven't looked before, necessarily in the Irish labour pool. They're also increasingly looking outside Ireland. It's interesting as well, the changed kind of profile of people coming into the Irish economy. We probably typically thought maybe 10, 15 years ago of within the EU, mostly from the, at that stage, accession countries coming into the EU as opening up this big labour market. But if you look at the numbers now, we're seeing them come from outside the EU mostly. We're seeing large numbers, even excluding, the large number of Ukrainian refugees coming into the country. You're seeing in the labour market, lots and lots of people coming from outside the EU, from countries in South America, in Southeast Asia, and other places. So that kind of search for talent is going much further away from Irish shores, and increasingly so. And like, that's only natural when companies are trying to fill roles. And if you look within Europe, some of the countries that we traditionally got people to come into the country from have caught up with us, or are catching up with us in terms of what they can offer, what they can offer employees, what they can offer in terms of both employment opportunities, but also in terms of things like cost of living and housing, a major challenge for employers. And we see lots of people struggling to tap traditional non-Irish labour pools because of that housing crisis, and increasingly going further and further to try and search for talent. But in a globalized economy, you expect to have a globalized labour pool, and it's hugely important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing that more than ever at Hayes. We're working with more and more organizations now around visas, and we're seeing we're absolutely are open to it now, where they would never have been 5 years ago, 6 years ago, would never have been a contention. It would, as you said, have been looking at Ireland, and then maybe UK, and then maybe Europe, but never beyond it. But there definitely does seem to be a change there, which is great to see, and we probably have no choice. And then if we look internal challenges, again, the 12 months, it's very, the talent retention piece is there, and it was the same last year. So I know you mentioned what organizations, Vicky, are doing around their EVP, and purpose has never been more as important to talent when it comes to looking at new opportunities. The other area, I suppose, which was quite surprised, company culture is one of the biggest movers when it comes to internal challenges. We're now went from 25% to 32%, as I said earlier. So 1 in 3 organizations foreseeing that this could be a challenge, will be a challenge over FY24. The concept of employee experience, I think you've touched on it, it's becoming rapidly paramount. And I suppose, why is that, and what does it mean?
I think it's become paramount because employee expectations are here to stay, right? So we're amidst, I guess, a workplace revolution. And that has been driven by industries converging, by organizations having to reinvent themselves, and by this rapid rise of digitalization. So when we talk about employee experience, and I think sometimes the terms can be confused. So when we talk about culture, that is something that you consciously curate to be able to deliver on your strategic intent. The experience then is how employees live that experience across the moments that matter in the talent life cycle. And then the value proposition is what captures all of that, and engagement is the outcome. Employee experience is implicit, because if you are stating that your culture is one thing and employees are not experiencing that, you have a massive disconnect in terms of authenticity, and a disconnect in terms of that connection back into organizational purpose. And that's where you will lose talent. And with the consumerization of work, employees have a lot more choice. And so organizations, they need to treat their employees like customers of the workforce, and make sure that the customer value proposition and the employee value proposition are aligned. So the other piece around that is, as well as understanding the employee experience across multiple spheres. So we're no longer, workplace is no longer the driving force behind work output. It is important in terms of bringing people together, in terms of connecting, collaborating, and that learning experience. But what's also important is how work is designed, and also the digital tools that employees are using, because they're actually expecting the same experience of their internal workplace digital tools as they get from their consumed tools outside of the workplace. So I think, as well as, you know, in addition to that, and another challenge, I guess, is the geopolitical environment and all of the external factors and pressures. So we're seeing ESG spill into the boardroom, we're seeing well-being spill into the boardroom, and employees actually expecting employers to have a social conscience and to do more towards contributing to the greater purpose and to the sustainability of the planet and the betterment of society. So that rise of worker agency and that rise of employee activism, I guess, is having an impact on business. And those businesses that tend to invest in connecting people into their higher purpose, into their culture, are the businesses that tend to accelerate their engagement statistics, which has a massive return on investment in terms of bottom line. Yeah. So in speaking with organizations that, you know, again, are trying to overcome this war on wages, we often go back to employee experience and ask them, what is the culture that you're trying to curate? And then trying to figure out the mechanisms to do that, which often ends up steering into a conversation, for example, around the remote and hybrid experience, the development opportunities that we touched on before, and that performance experience as well.
Okay, right. And yeah, and that came through in our own research where 83% of employees said organization purpose is an important consideration when they are accessing a new role, and 75% said that the organization's commitment to sustainability is also important. So quite rightly, you know, you're saying this is the reality, and you know the research is telling us, so organizations need to adapt. How do you see it changing or evolving over time? Is this relatively new, or organizations very much on top of this, or we need to be if we're not?
I see it changing in terms, again, of the leadership imperative. So like the traditional definition of leadership capabilities have changed. Work is becoming a lot more boundaryless. And I think where we can unbox jobs, that's where we release human potential. And that's that shift towards focusing on skills and lifelong learning. But that requires a very, very different mindset. So I think the change will come through emphasis on the new world of leadership in the new world of work, and what actually, you know, again, working with our membership, I'll often ask them, they'll talk about culture, and I'll say, well, why have, you know, how would you describe your culture, and why have you decided that that's important for your business and your strategic imperative? And then what does that mean in terms of how you define leadership? Mm-hmm. Because the old models of leadership are not working. And often the pushback around remote work, for example, remote work doesn't work. It's often not the remote work, it's often the leadership or the employee experience or the culture piece that is actually the issue. So in terms of employee expectations, I think they will expect a lot more from leaders going forward. And I think that's a really good starting point for businesses.
Okay, excellent, very good. And then just, and we will touch on hybrid flexible working, because again, it's quite topical. It continues to be topical and continues to be very much on the agenda. Before we move on, one other thing, and you mentioned, I suppose, just the challenges and the revolution that organizations are having at this moment in time. Intergenerational workforce. I think we probably never had as many generations working together, you know, and we're probably, they say 5, I think it's 4/5 with Gen Z entering, and then we have silent generation veterans, I think they call it state, leaving. It's never been more challenging for the HR community, for organizations. Again, Vicky, I'd be interested to get your thoughts, and Jared, on that, and just what organizations should be considering, and maybe what you're seeing your members, how they're addressing it.
Sure. Look, I think when it comes, so if we talk about intergenerational, that's one component, right? When you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, organizations are struggling with the volume of requirements at the moment that they need to navigate. And I think where intergenerational impact or impact of inclusion and belonging happens best is where it's weaved throughout the employment life cycle. So one of the challenges, I guess, with intergenerational leadership is a disconnect, and a disconnect culturally, but also disconnect in terms of how work is delivered. So an example of that is We have now in the workplace digital nomads, digital natives, and digital immigrants. So certain cohorts of people will adapt more quickly to new technologies. And that brings into question how that again impacts leadership. So if you have a leadership cohort that is trying to lead, that is not digitally native, that is trying to lead a cohort of digital natives, there can be fractures in the workplace in terms of expectations. So I think it's really important to consider that from a technology perspective, from a leadership perspective, and then from a mentorship perspective. So there's, I guess, a lot of research out there at the moment that actually demonstrates that younger cohorts or new career starters are more inclined to actually want to have more presence in the workplace and more interaction in person with their leaders. Now, look, that will change depending on some of those social challenges like housing and getting into the office. But it's because they feel that they're missing out on some of those really critical learning moments. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when you're looking at your model and your design and some of those learning experiences, it is really important to consider, for example, the 70-20-10 model of learning design. How are you incorporating those in-person connections and those learning experiences across generations and across more mature and less mature workers to make sure that some of those skills are transferred? And I think that's a really important factor to consider when you are designing some of those employee experiences like we talked about before.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, Jared, if you anything you'd like to, you want to feel free to jump in.
Yeah, like what Vicky said is all correct. Like, I mean, it underlines for leaders the kind of importance of understanding and kind of empathy, to understand that people have very different needs and very different experiences in the workplace. One of the things that came out of the recent census is this growth, not just in the workplace, but at home as well, of multi-generational households because of the housing crisis. So people aren't just in the workplace with multi-generational workplaces, they're also at home with multi-generational households now increasingly. And massive differences in expectations. Like, we see it come back into the workplace, the challenge of intergenerational splits in access to home ownership, for example, and expectations around things like home ownership, also expectations around how your career translates into a kind of a standard of living over time. Similarly with issues like climate change, that things that are big differences externally are in the workplace as well, in terms of attitudes and the importance and how people deal with some of those issues. So it's a massive challenge. Like, there has always been an intergenerational spread in the workplace of different generations. But I think the big gap we have at the moment is in society more generally. There are big gaps, particularly on housing, I think is driving a lot of it. There are big gaps between generations outside the workplace that come into the workplace too, and are reflected back in the relationships across the expectations people have of their employer.
I think to add to that as well, people have a choice now because our life expectancy is increasing. People have a choice now to work longer and to structure how they work differently. So that I think there's an opportunity there in talent attraction strategy, for example, to consider how can we tap into some of that talent. So, for example, there's some stats, unfortunately I don't have Irish stats, but coming out of the US where more than 50% of contractors are over the age of 50 and 20% of those are over the age of 65. So, how are we actually planning for this workforce, and how are we, when we talk about benefits strategy, how are we actually personalizing benefits to suit different life stages and personalizing experiences to suit different life stages? Because that is how we tap into that really rich source of talent and how we continue to have that ongoing pipeline into the future, because people will potentially work longer, particularly if there is a continued cost of living crisis. People need to work longer or take up additional job opportunities.
And pensions, and absolutely. And there's actually some findings around that workforce planning within the salary guide. I don't have the stats, but they're low. There's a certain amount of organizations are doing it, but there's a lot of organizations that aren't thinking that long term, but it is in the salary guide. I think it takes us on to, I suppose, you touched on skilling and upskilling, and I think probably let's go down that route again around the skill shortage. I suppose what my observation from the findings this year was, I'm just feeling there seems to be a mindset change around the willingness to upskill employees. It was always there, but it just seems a little bit more pronounced. But importantly as well, the observation that employees' willingness to learn is equally important. But 71% of employers said that employees' willingness to learn is more important than their existing skill set. 20% of employers said it's not important for a job applicant to have a degree, and a further 52% said it isn't an essential requirement, and we wouldn't always have seen that before. And then 81% would like to hire a professional without all the required skills for a role with the intention of upskilling them. So employers, again, back to evolving, thinking differently, but that I suppose that now view is that they're very, organizations are thinking differently around that the talent, potentially other sources, but that hire the attitude and let's train the skill. Again, are you seeing that? I suppose there are insights into that, and how does that align with what you're seeing in IBEC potentially?
Yeah, look, again, a changing world requires us to act differently, think differently, and react differently. And it's actually very promising to see organizations starting to evolve with that frame of mind. Where the real potential is where organizations can actually create opportunity for people to learn in the flow of work and increase their capacity to learn. So there's a bit of a tug of war going on at the moment where organizations are saying, right, we need to diversify skills, we need to enhance learning, and we need to build this pipeline. But they're not freeing up capacity within people's roles to be able to do that. And that's, again, where technology could play a role in trying to introduce some efficiencies so that they can free up that capacity to learn. So definitely organizations are willing to invest more in skills development. In fact, 55% of respondents to one of our recent surveys have implemented learning technology within the last few years, and over a third of organizations investing more in internal training. Where the real potential is where we marry that then with career progression, because we know employees are leaving to look at other career opportunities for career progression. Jer mentioned it before, the expectation around career and the impact that has on quality of life. We have a lot of smaller organizations operating here in the Irish market, so career progression is not always rapidly available. So where we would coach our member businesses would be to focus not necessarily on career progression within a current career pathway, but start to look across the organization at other opportunities to progress, at other sort of opportunities for internal mobility or succession that isn't just horizontal, but actually lateral, and also incorporate some of those personal development goals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. And Jared, are you seeing anything from your policy side coming through around skills?
Yeah, like it's encouraging to see more employers willing to take on that journey in lifelong learning, because it requires not just in terms of resources, it also requires a lot in terms of time that people give up, and lots of businesses stretched, and particularly the SMEs, where you mightn't automatically have someone to backfill a role or help to backfill a role if someone needs hours off during the week. What we've seen traditionally in the Irish market, if you look at compared to the rest of Europe, effectively, we're kind of mid-table when it comes to lifelong learning. We're okay, but there are countries out there, particularly in the Nordics, in Germany and other countries, where you would have 3 times as high like lifelong learning here. So doing more education, going into further and higher education after you've kind of established your career is probably around 10% here, and it's upwards of 30-35% in some of those other Northern European economies. So we have a long road to go, but from an Irish labour market point of view, it's a huge opportunity if we can get it right, and it's an area that we've been working very closely on with the government. In that, we have a national training fund that all employers pay now 1% of payroll into. There's €1.5 billion of a surplus in that fund, and releasing that money to encourage employers, where possible, to fund new and look, we're going to need a lot of upskilling in the coming years, given the changes in technology in particular. If you look at the impact AI and robotics and all the rest will have in the workplace, it's going to be enormous. And you will need people to work for longer, who are working for longer, as Vicky said, because we have an older workforce, that we're going to have them also needing to do more in terms of education and as their career progresses and time moves on. So there's a huge opportunity here. It's a challenge, but it's a huge opportunity, and one of the ones that we see. Ireland sits behind a lot of the best countries in Europe, and we could, if we bridge that gap, get a huge amount of value out of it. So it's something that's a big focus for us from a policy perspective.
So opportunity, but economically important as well, that we do it. We need to do it. Okay, and then just one question that came through that probably would link in, and apologies, we did get questions, I meant to say it earlier, but we're trying to cover them as much as we can through our discussion here today. And it was around any insights on key capabilities of the future. And I know, Vicky, you wanted to just maybe touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of links back into the education system and that sort of approach to lifelong learning and skills development. What's going to be really, really important moving forward as technology starts to sort of enhance our ability to perform certain tasks is our ability to analyze. So those analytical skills, critical thinking, asking the right questions, and the leadership capabilities that we spoke of before. So DETI has actually released some research on emerging skills required over the next few years within the leadership space as well as within the technology space. There's plenty of data out there, but I think what's going to become more and more important are the human skills and the skills required to be able to motivate, engage, empathize, and analyze problems and come up with solutions. So I encourage anyone attending today, if they do want access to some of those skills reports, feel free to reach out. I know Maureen, you'll probably share our details, but more than happy to share that research. It's no problem.
Great, thank you, Vicky. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if anybody's interested, let us know, and we'll make sure to connect you with Vicky. You've mentioned it already, both of you have, and word of the year, I believe, by Collins Dictionary, AI. So AI in the workplace, and again, if we refer back to the research, it's not surprising as a result that one of the challenges that have been highlighted and has moved is that keeping up with technology and innovation was a lot more pronounced this year. It went from 11% last year to 22% this year. So I know, Vicky, IBEC recently held a HR leadership summit, and AI was the key theme. So why did you choose that theme? Something coming through from the members?
Yeah, look, I think it's I've said it's the word of the year, but also because AI has a real potential to enhance worker productivity, and where we have and not only that, what's the knock-on effect of that? It can improve lives and positively impact society in our world, right? So where there was pressure on business to do more with less talent and to try and attract skills and balance that off with well-being. So we're trying to drive productivity and performance when workers are already, I often use the language, we talked a while back about the energy crisis. Well, there's actually a human energy crisis. People are fatigued and well-being, as I said before, is spilling into the boardroom. So we need to be able to use AI and technology to enhance productivity. And, this potential can only really be achieved with the right mechanisms and human interventions, as well as the right skills. So there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and polarization around this topic. AI is not actually a new development. It's an evolution that's accelerating. And as an economy, we can keep up and reap the reward or fall behind. So some of that fear is warranted, and if worked through, could lead to almost some needed introspection. So for example, there's a lot of content and a lot of conversation around the fear of programming today's biases into tomorrow's technology. Well, these biases weren't created by AI. These biases are actually human biases that are corrupting technology. So this gives us an opportunity to put a mirror up to ourselves as a society and to ask, how can we do better? So Access is another risk, for example, and making sure that the potential of this technology is accessible to all. IBEC is actually part of a working group currently, exploring the best approach for the implementation of the autonomous framework for AI. So whether we realise it or not, employees are already using this, right? A lot of the research actually shows about 30 to 35% of employees are using this. So businesses need to consider now what interventions are needed to mitigate some of the risk factors. Most HR tasks, for example, are nominated high risk, but also to consider how can we take advantage of this to accelerate forward the human agenda. I think with the right approach, it has huge potential as long as we take that risk-based, human-first approach.
Yeah. Okay. And Jared, just what should organisations from a policy perspective, because this again, it's huge, just should be aware of, maybe mindful of when looking at AI or implementing it?
Yeah, like it's a huge change. Like as Vicky said, it's not new in the sense that we've had automation of tasks for forever, and for anyone who doesn't remember, we used to use Zoom or Microsoft Teams not so long ago either, and the same with word processing, with emails, with diaries online, all the rest of it, and that has had an impact in certain roles, that you see changes in roles, disappearance of some roles, but it's about that kind of reskilling piece, and it's also a massive opportunity for, as Vicky said again, not to be a substitute for existing work and existing skills, but a complement to existing work and existing skills. And I think that's the key from a workplace point of view, is trying to find, and from an economic point of view, is trying to find ways to make sure that AI as it develops is a complement towards existing skills, that it takes away some of the boring parts, dare I say it, of parts of our work. And I've tried it in parts of my job, and it could do a pretty good job at elements of my role. Thankfully, not all of it. But you could see how, if done wrongly, if we knee-jerk over-regulate, if we knee-jerk respond to it even within the workplace, that you lose the potential of it. But if we do it in the right way, if we try to find complementarities with how we do work and try and find ways that it improves even the kind of quality of work that we're doing and the interesting work that we're doing, and allows people to advance themselves into the more, I suppose, cerebral parts of their jobs and the parts of their jobs that they enjoy, there is huge potential in it to both improve the workplace and also, as Vicky said, the kind of productivity at an economic level. So it's really, really exciting. And there's lots of scare stories about it, because we're all used to science fiction movies and all the rest, but actually there are really exciting possibilities with it as well, and it's about finding the right way to regulate that. And look, we'll have or are in the process of having an AI Act in Europe. Europe is first mover on a lot of these areas to try and get out ahead and regulate, but doing it in a balanced way and making sure that we don't allow our fears dominate our kind of possibilities in this space is really important.
Yeah.
And I might just jump in there quickly on that focus of a balanced view. I think it is really, like, some of our member organizations are starting to test this technology, which is great, but it is very important that human-centered design is at the fore, and that you are going through a risk assessment. So the high-level expert group on AI, which was set up by the European Commission, has actually released a self-assessment list that looks at the implementation of trustworthy AI. So, if this is something you're exploring, I'd encourage you to look that up. And as I mentioned before, most HR activities are on the high risk end of the scale. But that's not to say that we shouldn't investigate and explore, using that human-centered, risk-based approach to implement, and rather than rushing into it and then retrospectively trying to refit, because that's only going to damage culture and damage trust within an organization.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you, Vicky. And as you said earlier, what's really important, just around probably what AI can't is the communication, the empathy, the person stuff. Yeah, that each of us as human beings bring to the table every day. Okay, excellent. Really, really interesting. Okay, so moving then along, I suppose, ways of working. again, great to see work-life balance. There was no change from last year, 58% citing they have a good work-life balance. But there is some media narrative recently around employers wanting to have people back in the office more. 38% of employers in our research said employees will need to be in the workplace more often. Why do you think this is happening, or is there a narrative change? Again, open to both of you.
Yeah, look, I think it's for a blend of reasons, and I feel like I've harped on a lot today about leadership. But I do think investment in leadership is required. And I'm not sure, I think, you know, we all found ourselves in a remote work context, and everyone was remote. Now we've tried to sort of find that blend and find that balance. But what I think is striking is that a lot of organizations that we speak to have moved to a hybrid model without investing in leadership training and development in terms of how to manage and lead in a hybrid environment, and without investment in other tools, technology, as well as their on-site workplace. So what is promising to see from our own IBEX survey results on remote and hybrid is that organizations are, there are a lot of organizations mandating a return to the office, but they are also, I guess, investing in some of the pull factors. So looking at, on-site collaboration days, looking at sort of making sure that there are like benefits to coming into the office, and consciously curating some of those in-person interactions. For example, looking at collaboration across projects. So how can we mix teams across the business to work on a particular problem and focus that problem solving in an insight capacity? The reasons that people are probably trying to draw people back to the office are probably connected back into some of the challenges that you spoke about, Maureen. Those challenges around culture, those challenges around, I talked about well-being. Loneliness is a huge issue for people in the workplace right now. Challenges around intergenerational leadership and curating some of those learning moments for new starters. So, there is no right or wrong. And again, it's another polarizing topic. What needs to be considered, I guess, is how, peeling back, whether it's a, mandated 2 days or 3 days, and actually looking at, well, how are you designing work, and how are you designing the moments that matter, and why are you bringing people into the office? Because a lot of members will go, oh, it's culture, but then they don't do anything to curate the culture. It's like, okay, great. So how are you curating the culture when people do come into the office? And we're seeing way more organizations invest in that now, which is really promising.
Okay, good, excellent. And Jared, is there anything else organizations should be conscious of or aware of when designing that new ways of working when it comes to hybrid or flexible working?
Yeah, we track it fairly closely through the CSO, their labour force survey, and what you've seen kind of happen is a move from the 0 days to kind of 2 or 3, that kind of hybrid, but the people who are doing 2 or 3 not moving to 4 or 5. So hybrid is really settling in as a model, and the kind of share of the workforce now that are hybrid is either hybrid or remote is pretty steady, but it's been the shift within that from fully remote roles or nearly fully remote roles to more hybrid roles. So we're seeing that kind of hybridization of work. As Vicky said, that approach of making sure that you have a value proposition if you're asking people to spend more time in the office when they might not necessarily want to, and we can see that in the survey results, that people would prefer to have hybrid options. If you're not going to give them the options on that side, you have to give a value proposition on the other side to justify it. And as Vicky said, the danger is for organizations focusing on, well, people have to be back in, talking about, well, it's important for innovation, culture, it's important for learning and mentorship and all those things, which it is. But if you're not also investing in those things at the same time and making it very clear that those things are important, if people come back in and they're spending a lot of the day in the office without any of those things being really relevant in their work, then you're going to isolate people, and people will get angsty about the office, that they'll start to despise the office. So it's really important that people recognize that you have a strategy for bringing people back and how to maximize it. And the other part, I suppose, is that kind of, we talked about intergenerational workforce, that different generations within the workforce and different life stages will have very different attitudes towards office, the benefits of not being in the office, especially kind of younger workers, hugely beneficial at an early stage, might not have the space at home. Workers who have young families, who might have lots of responsibilities that they're trying to juggle, and it's really beneficial where they have hybrid. And then older workers who are past that stage again, you know, so it's hugely challenging for workplaces to get it right. But what I would say is that the worst thing of all is to say everybody back and not have a plan for it on how you engage them once they are back, and that's key, and we see it across lots of our members thinking about it very hard, about how they engage once you're back and how you build a new culture, because it isn't just snap back, people turn back in the office in 2019 is back to normal. It's a completely different culture that needs building.
Yeah.
And that's where the worker consultation piece is really important. Like, where we see it succeed most is where there is that worker consultation in advance and a co-design process, versus like sometimes, I guess, if we're not getting a spread of views, as Ger said, whether that's intergenerationally or whatever the case may be, you know, we know, for example, remote work actually had a positive impact on diversity in the workplace in certain situations. For example, people with accessibility needs or disability found themselves being able to avail of additional opportunities. But where it's had a negative impact is where the return to work or the hybrid model has changed and the consultation hasn't happened, because some of those needs haven't been taken into consideration. So I would encourage organizations, before they jump into design, to consider that consultation and co-creation methodology.
It's worth adding to that, actually, Vicky, that if you look at the data on the labour force, almost 3/4 of the additional people, I was talking about 350,000 additional people, almost 3/4 of that 350,000 were women in the last number of years. That as you've seen flexibility come into that discussion, the participation rates of women, particularly women with young kids in the workforce, has absolutely skyrocketed, and not just in Ireland, but more or less everywhere. So it's a big consideration for workplaces, that balance between talent and the kind of hybrid setup.
Yeah, and that was really, but because female participation in Ireland was low compared to our counterparts elsewhere in Europe and the States. So a really positive outcome for us as an economy and as a nation. I suppose the other things, you know, back to the very practical piece, is that there's still a skill shortage, that a talent attraction is really important. And we do know, and I know it anecdotally within our own business, you know, if you decide to go full-time back, and it is a knowledge-based job where you potentially could do it hybrid or flexibly, you're probably halving your shortlist immediately. So I suppose that's something else for organizations to consider. But I suppose, yeah, it definitely, but is suppose being spoken about more, but also the research. And again, you know, when you go through the salary guide, as you said, Jared, it's not a full-time back, it's just maybe going from 0 days to 1 day, or 1 day to 2 day, essentially is what's trending at the moment. Okay, so I'm very conscious now, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and just one other thing I might ask you, just changes that are coming our way, and pension enrollment is coming in 2024. So I think it was meant to be September. I believe that might be pushed back now. So again, really interested in if you've got any insights as to what's happening, and then from an employer perspective, what should we be doing to prepare for it?
So we've met the minister and lots of people within the political system even the last number of weeks, and they're still guiding the kind of tail end of 2024 as being the kind of time that we'll see auto enrollment. I have yet to meet anyone in the pensions industry that believes that date, because they think the systems won't be set up and running on time, but it's still official government policy that it'll be September of next year. I would suspect, if you had to hold me to it now, it'll probably be late before we actually see auto enrollment set up. But look, for HR teams, for finance teams planning for 2024, 2025, it still means that this is something you have to prepare for, as if the government are going to succeed for September, because ultimately they could be successful, and we could just all be too negative, and the pensions industry might be too negative. They might succeed, and even if they don't, this is a delay of months rather than years. The other thing that is coming in through all of this is, look, we're going to have multiple elections next year. We mightn't necessarily have anyone in place to implement auto enrollment. There mightn't be a government by this time next year, so there's possible delays there too. But ultimately, you're talking about early 25, if not 24, and the government's still guiding 24, so people still need to prepare. And the large challenge we see with auto enrollment, it started as a system to grab the people who aren't covered by the pension system, because they're starting to include, or planning to include, people who are, for example, not for 6 months of their job enrolled in the pension scheme of their employer through probationary periods and all the rest. That's the challenge that we really see, along with the general administration. The other major thing we see is enhanced reporting coming from January. That is going to be a nightmare for finance and HR teams in terms of reporting to revenue on expenses in particular. So there's, as always, unfortunately, in the last number of years, lots of work ahead for HR teams in the next 12 months or so.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Vicky, final word. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add on that.
No, I guess
just prepare.
Empathy for our HR teams. Yeah. You know, a lot of the work that I would do as well, and you know, if there are members on today, is really look at HR maturity, because of the emerging skill requirements for HR teams to be able to diversify into some of those areas of HR, technology, and then as Ger said, you know, some of those enhanced reporting requirements, as well as the legislation coming down the track. So you know, I would encourage businesses to look at their model, and to look at their HR deliverables, and to make sure that, you know, HR continues to be seen as a strategic partner in the business. And, you know, how can we free up some of the waste and operational waste within the roles to make sure that they continue to add as much value and impact in an organization as possible.
Getting more complex. The organizations are becoming more complex than they were ever before. So yeah, it's absolutely really, really important. Okay, that brings us to an end. 1 minute to go. So we do like to finish up by 1 o'clock and let everybody 1 hour, and keep it to the 1 hour. Thank you both so much for your time and your insights. I really enjoyed that conversation. I know I got a huge amount to take away from it. So thank you, George. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you all who have joined us today, and if you'd like to get access to the full findings, there's the link now too, so feel free to request it through there, but also there will be a link sent to your inbox where you can also request it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your consultant again, and if you have any questions for Vicky and Jared, we can share your contact details in relation to what was spoken about today. And thank you all again for your time. Have a lovely afternoon and take care.